Welcome to the Georgia Archives Virtual Lunch and Learn program. I'm Penny Cliff, Education Specialist here at the Archives. We're glad that you've joined us for our December presentation, A Brief History of the Atlanta Fire Department. Our Lunch and Learn programs are held on the second Friday of the month and are sponsored by Friends of Georgia Archives and History. Thank you, FOGA. If you want to learn about FOGA or purchase this year's Christmas ornament, it's really nice, go to www.fogah.org. It's a two-sided ornament that features the fireplaces from the House and Senate chambers, which were used by the Georgia General Assembly. During this pandemic, we want to offer you lunch and learn programs safely in a virtual format. As always, I'm thankful that my colleague Alec Hawthorne is taking care of the technical side of these virtual presentations. Alec will upload the video of this lunch and learn to our YouTube channel, Georgia Archives. So if you have friends who are unable to watch the presentation live, they don't have to miss out. You can always see them later on YouTube. We are very pleased to have as our December Lunch and Learn presenter, Chief Joe Tolbert, who will answer any of your questions at the end of his presentation. Just look for the little Q&A. Chief Tolbert was born and raised in the city of Atlanta. He is a fifth-generation Atlanta firefighter. His great-great-grandfather began the family tradition of working in the fire service with the Atlanta Volunteer Fire Department in 1870. Chief Tolbert joined the Atlanta Fire Department in 1972 and has served in every rank and capacity within the Atlanta Fire Department, up to and including Acting Fire Chief. During his career, he held the following ranks: Apparatus Operator, Bomb Technician, Chief's Aide, Captain, Battalion Chief, Assistant Chief, and Deputy Chief. He attended Georgia State University and Brenau College. He is a certified fire instructor, safety officer, fire investigator, and hazardous materials technician. During his career, Chief Tolbert received numerous citations and commendations for heroism and bravery. These awards include the Phoenix Award, given by Mayor Andrew Young, and a Certificate of Special Congressional Recognition given by the late Congressman John Lewis. We are very, very happy to welcome Chief Tolbert.
Thank you very much. It's my privilege to be here and talk about what's not just my career, but in many regards, the family business. As Penny said, we began our career in the fire service in 1870, and we have continued that through today, and my son continues the tradition today as he is a captain with the Atlanta Fire Department working at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The fire service in Atlanta and the fire service all over this country literally began in its infancy the same way, very, very small, and grew to be, in major cities, a large metropolitan all-hazard agency which could manage pretty much any incident that occurred within the city limits. But first, let me say that I dedicate this and every presentation I give to the 53 members of the Atlanta Fire Department who gave their lives in the performance of their duties. Almost from the beginning up until a few years ago, unfortunately, firefighters in the course of their duties have sacrificed their lives in order to protect the citizens and the property of the city of Atlanta and every city in Georgia and throughout the nation. But to begin this presentation, it starts simply with a fire bucket. The city of Atlanta in 1848, because of a series of small fires, realized the need for some sort of fire protection. The first fire ordinance in Atlanta was enacted in February 1848, which required the citizens of the city of Atlanta to provide 2 fire buckets for the use of the fire brigade in case a fire occurred. At the time, you say, well, Atlanta's a big city. Well, Atlanta in 1848 was a really small town. It was a railroad town. The capital of the state of Georgia was still in Milledgeville, Georgia, so Atlanta was just literally a railroad hub. Primarily wooden structures, close together, and most of them were concentrated in the area which we know now as underground Atlanta in the Alabama Pryor Street area. The fire brigade was organized in 1848. A major fire did not occur until 1850. And in 1850, a fire began in a cotton warehouse on Alabama Street between Pryor and Central Avenue, which obviously, if you imagine a cotton warehouse on fire, the idea of throwing buckets of water on it literally didn't put anything out but the ashes and the smoldering when the building was completely consumed. So the city passed an ordinance again in 1851 authorizing the need for organized fire protection. But prior to that, the fire brigade began by simply purchasing what is the first piece of fire equipment bought by the city of Atlanta. It was a Hunneman and Company hand fire engine. If you notice the handles on either side, those were handles that the firefighters literally stood on either side of and pumped to create the pressure which came through the very, very long nozzle, which was attached to a fire hose and always kept on top of the fire engine. This magnificent piece of equipment was purchased April 12, 1852 for a grand sum of $319.95, which at the time was an astronomical amount of money for the city to put into something that would be rarely used. By 1852, the fire department in Atlanta had become organized. Not only did they have this at the time, the state-of-the-art hand fire engine, which was pulled to the fire by these members that you see in this very grainy photograph taken in 1856. Here we have the old hand engine, and next to it was the hose reel, which carried the leather fire hose. Rubber was not introduced into Atlanta at that time. The fire hose was leather. So there was 1,000 feet of fire hose carried on this on the fire hose reel, and it was pulled to the fire by the firefighters in the city of Atlanta. And they also pulled the hand engine to the fire. So the question begs, well, where did they get their water from? Within the city of Atlanta, in anticipation of all of this and to maintain water for the citizens of the city, there were 5 fire cisterns located strategically throughout the city of Atlanta. The largest one was in the intersection right in the middle of what today is known as 5 Points. That cistern is still under the layers and layers and layers of pavement and blocks and everything else in downtown Atlanta. Obviously, we don't use it, but they chose over the years to keep it even into the 1920s for an emergency should the water system in the city of Atlanta fail. Obviously, time and technology took its toll on the old hand fire engines in the city of Atlanta. In the early 1860s, bought their first steam fire engine. It was still being pulled to the fires by hand, if you will, but it had the capability, as you can see, it had the beginnings of a seat here and the ability to be pulled by horses should the need arise. In one of the winters in the late 1860s, Atlanta experienced a tremendous snowfall where the firefighters could not pull the engine to a fire that occurred on Alabama Street. So the firefighters at that time decided to hitch horses to this fire engine and pull it. After that, every fire engine in the city of Atlanta was pulled by horses. As the city of Atlanta continued to grow, it grew from this little bitty railroad town by the time after the Civil War into a growing metropolitan area. So the need for more than one fire engine and more than one volunteer fire company became necessary. Keep in mind that there were still no paid firefighters in the city of Atlanta to do this. Everything was done by volunteers who basically left their place of employment when the big fire bell rang, and it was located downtown on top of the fire station where this piece of equipment was kept. They rang the big bell, and the volunteer firefighters in the city of Atlanta, who were by way some of the most prominent citizens in the city of Atlanta. For those of you who remember one of the many renovations of underground Atlanta years ago, there was a saloon in downtown in underground Atlanta called Mullenbrink Saloon. Henry Mullenbrink, who owned that saloon, was one of the more prominent members of the Atlanta Volunteer Fire Department. As time went on, the Atlanta Volunteer Fire Department grew from this one engine to 5 companies and over 139 members. It was a very select group of people, and you had to be voted in. And once you were voted in, if your conduct did not rise to what they considered to be appropriate or proper for the membership to continue, you were basically blackballed and removed from membership in the Atlanta Fire Department. By 1870, the Atlanta Fire Department had grown into 3 companies. This particular company that we see here was Tallulah Fire Company number 3. And if you notice, this photograph was taken in front of their fire hall, which was located on Broad Street in Atlanta. On a personal note, this gentleman sitting on the seat here, who was the driver and by now the first paid member of Tallulah Fire Company, was my great-grandfather. He became associated with the fire service in the city of Atlanta, not because of his ability as a firefighter, but he owned one of the first livery stables in the city of Atlanta, and his ability to manage and handle a team of horses was considered exceptional, and he was hired and lobbied to become one of the first paid members of what was then the Atlanta Volunteer Fire Department. Once again, this was a select group of people who dropped whatever they were doing in an effort to maintain and fight fires in the city of Atlanta. So you can imagine, if you will, the delay and the amount of time it took from the realization that a fire occurred in the city to someone going to the fire hall and ringing the big bell, which alerted all the volunteer firefighters to report to their stations, discover the location of the fire, and arrive there in a manner timely enough to put the fire out. This system was used by virtually every fire department in the United States, and this evolution in the fire service pretty much occurred in every major metropolitan area in the United States. Depending on the growth and the size of this metropolitan area, that determined at what point in this evolution that the fire service stopped evolving. Even to this day, over 70% of the firefighting done in the United States is done by volunteer firefighters. Slightly over 30% of the firefighters in the United States are paid for their profession, and the rest are volunteers. Even within metropolitan Atlanta, in the 20-county area, you still have volunteer firefighters working day in and day out. By the late 1870s, there were 5 fire companies located in the city of Atlanta, and these gentlemen were members of the Gate City Volunteer Fire Department. The Gate City Fire Department was located just north of 5 Points in downtown Atlanta. They are dressed in what would be their parade uniforms with their number and their parade belts and their fancy parade caps, and also this odd thing that they're holding. This is the speaking trumpet that firefighters used to give orders every time they went to a fire. The chief officer in charge of the fire, since there was a great deal of noise and clamor going on, had to be able to direct his orders, and also early on to call the cadence for the hand pump so that one side wouldn't pull while the other side was pushing. This particular piece of equipment is known as a speaking trumpet. To this day, it is still used as an indication of the rank of a firefighter within the fire service. It is a part of the collar insignia worn by the majority of firefighters in the fire service in Atlanta to this day. The number of speaking trumpets on your collar insignia indicate your rank. One speaking trumpet indicates the rank of lieutenant. Two parallel trumpets indicates the rank of captain. Two crossed speaking trumpets begins the rank of chief. At the lowest level, the battalion chief. 3 crossed trumpets indicates assistant chief, 4 deputy chief, and the fire chief wears 5 trumpets on his collar insignia. Atlanta had grown and grown and grown, and by the late 1870s had become the capital of the state of Georgia. The property where the state capitol was built was given to the state of Georgia from the city of Atlanta because that was the location of the original Atlanta City Hall. It was literally moved across and down the street some, and that property was given to the state because it is one of the highest points in the city of Atlanta, and it was given to the state to build the state capitol. But the challenge with the volunteer firefighters was simply the fact that as the city grew, the number of firefighters, as their businesses grew, began to diminish. And also, in the winter of 1881, there was a terrible fire occurred at Alabama and Pryor Street, which consumed the S&S Packing Company, a major cotton warehouse, and the mechanical rooms and the repair facilities for the railroad. Everything burned to the ground because of what they said then was the lack of experience, which is not necessarily true, but just the lack of numbers and the time it took the firefighters to get to this location to put the fire out. So in January of 1882, the mayor of the city of Atlanta, James W. English, made the following statement. We should have a fire department composed of men who are regularly employed and paid for their services. It is asking too much that men should leave their occupation at the tap of the bell to labor in the interest of others and at a loss to themselves. You can imagine that a firefighter at that time, and they were called firemen from the 1880s, if he had a business, and one of the bakers in Atlanta who owned the largest bakery was a gentleman by the name of Jacob Immel. Well, if Jacob was the only one in the bakery at the time, he had to close and lock his business in order to go labor at the fire. And fires at that time took a great deal of time to extinguish when you consider all of the things that we just mentioned. Receiving the alarm, getting the apparatus to the scene, extinguishing the fire, and then putting everything back in order for the fire company and the units to be ready for the next call. So the citizens literally outcried that it was time for Atlanta to begin the possibility of paying the firefighters and establishing the paid fire service in Atlanta and disassembling the old volunteer fire department in the city of Atlanta. By the time that Mayor English made this statement, the city of Atlanta had 6 volunteer fire companies. Blue Eagle Fire Company number 6 was established 1 year before the end of the volunteer fire department. Blue Eagle was unique in the fact that it was the only all-African American fire company to have worked in the city of Atlanta. But by 1882 in January, the wheels began to turn in order to take these 6 companies from a volunteer service in order to hire and maintain the fire protection in Atlanta on a paid basis. It took about 6 months for this to occur, and by July of 1882, on July 1st, the paid fire service in the city of Atlanta was formed. As we know how government generally works, the 6 fire companies in Atlanta, the volunteer fire companies, were replaced by 2 fire companies on a paid basis. So from a total of 6 companies that provided protection to the city of Atlanta and the citizens, the fire department was cut down to 2 companies, 1 steam fire engine company and 1 ladder company. By 1886, the fire service continued to grow in the city of Atlanta because they realized you can't replace a force of 6 companies and 139 firemen with 2 companies and 36 men. So by 1886, the old volunteer company known as Mechanics Fire Company No. 2 became a member of the paid fire department in the city of Atlanta as Steam Fire Engine Company No. 2. Steam Fire Engine Company No. 2 was located on the lot next to the church right across from what is now the state capitol of the state of Georgia. This particular property was owned by the church, but they leased the property and the building to the city of Atlanta in order to maintain the fire station there. And that property was maintained by the city of Atlanta for the purpose of a fire station up until the 1920s. The company you see here was the old Mechanics Volunteer Fire Company No. 2, which as a paid fire company became Steam Fire Engine Company No. 2. Once again, and I can't, hard for me to separate the history of the Atlanta Fire Department from the history of my family. This gentleman on the seat here is Clinton C. Tolbert, who was the driver and my great-great-grandfather. He was the first member of the family to get into the business, and he worked for the Atlanta Paid Fire Department until the late 1880s. As you can see, the steam engine and the horses greatly enhanced the ability to fight fires in the city of Atlanta. Firefighters bragged on the fact that they could take this steam fire engine sitting still in a fire station and the horses in stalls on either side of the apparatus room in the fire station, receive an alarm, hitch the horses, bring up a full head of steam on this fire engine, and be out the door within 45 seconds, which today is still the standard of response time for most fire departments in the city of Atlanta and throughout the country. Along with the steam fire engines, by 1886 in February, the city of Atlanta had purchased this Hayes 65-foot aerial ladder, which was capable of reaching, at that time, the top of every building, the roof of every building in the city of Atlanta. What's interesting about this particular photograph is the fact that this magnificent piece of equipment was so large that it required someone to turn the back wheel so this thing could make it around the corners and the tight spaces in the city of Atlanta. This position within the fire service to this day is still known as the tillerman, the gentleman who guides the rear wheels of the fire station. Also, this picture captures a gentleman by the name of Henry Lewis, who was without a doubt the first African-American member of the Atlanta Fire Department. If you'll notice, Henry is wearing the same uniform and the same badge as all of the other firefighters within this picture. Now, obviously, within the South, as the Jim Crow laws took effect, Henry lost his job, and the firefighters in the city of Atlanta remained 100% Caucasian until the 1960s. But at this time, Henry held the proud position of being the first and only African-American firefighter within the city limits of Atlanta. This particular fire station behind him, and you can see the arch of the door right here, was located on what then was South Broad Street. In Atlanta in the early days, 5 Points was the hub of activity, and any street that was south of 5 Points, Broad Street and Forsyth Street and the others carried the direction that they were from 5 Points. Everything south of 5 Points was South Broad Street, South Forsyth Street. Everything north carried the delineation of being north. So you knew immediately if you came to the city of Atlanta, where am I going? Well, that's on South Broad Street. So you know if you got to 5 Points, go south. The fire service in the city of Atlanta continued to grow as the city grew and the need for fire protection. Understanding that, as you can see by the buildings, they are built in what they call a common attic building, or what they call then taxpayer buildings, because they were paid by street frontage and lot size, so they only maintained a lot large enough to house the building. So all of the buildings were virtually connected. The possibility of fire spread in buildings like this was extensive. So the need for continued improvements in the fire service and continued additions to the number of fire stations in the city of Atlanta was always necessary. This gentleman here is Fire Chief William Joyner, who not only was he the fire chief in the city of Atlanta, he was an innovator in the fire service in the fact that he created many of the early firefighting appliances, the tools and techniques that firefighters use, and some of them in different configurations to this day. Chief Joyner was also the only fire chief in the city of Atlanta to ever be elected the mayor of the city. Chief Joyner, when he retired from the fire service, was elected mayor of the city of Atlanta in 1906. And to this day, Chief Joyner is the only fire chief to ever have been elected president of the International Association of Fire Chiefs for 3 terms. If you go to fire station number 1 on Elliott Street today, you can see a very large relief of Fire Chief Joyner that was made and placed on the old fire station number 1, which was located on Alabama Street. Chief Joyner goes down as one of the founding fathers of the fire service, as he came from the ranks of the volunteers. Many of the volunteers, almost half of the paid fire service in Atlanta, were volunteers who chose to leave their former occupations and become firemen in the city of Atlanta, and Chief Joyner was among that group. Chief Joyner was also instrumental in increasing not just the number of fire stations, but the quality of fire apparatus, the number of firemen on duty, and he also installed within the city of Atlanta the first fire alarm boxes, so you no longer had to run to the nearest fire station to get them to ring the bell to indicate there was a fire in the city. You could go to the street corner, pull the alarm box, and the firefighters in the stations could read it through the telegraph system and know where to respond to the fire, which at the time in the 1880s was instrumental in increasing not only the effectiveness of the fire service and the fire stations and the firefighters, but also reducing the fire loss considerably. All major cities at that time were greatly concerned about fire loss and fires encompassing the entire city and burning it to the ground, which is what is known as a conflagration, or a fire that would be so great as it would overwhelm the local resources available and literally burn cities to the ground. Many cities, as we know, in the 1870s, the Great Chicago Fire. Even as going back into the 1600s, the Great Fire of London burned down a great deal of London. So fire protection was paramount as cities grew and dwellings became larger and taller and more complicated and complex. As the firefighting grew and the number of firefighters grew, unfortunately, the city of Atlanta lost its first 2 firefighters in the line of duty. This fireman W.P. Leach and fireman H.O. Howell. H.O. Howell was the nephew of Judge Clark Howell, who was also the person that they named the second public housing project in the city of Atlanta after Clark Howell Homes. These gentlemen were killed at a fire that occurred on Alabama Street and Pryor Street during a building collapse. Even to this day, the firefighters that are not killed responding to alarms die in fires due to trap and collapse situations where buildings collapse upon them. These particular gentlemen were killed in a fire that occurred the day before they lost their lives, and they were there putting out hot spots and embers from the day before when the wind blew one of the sidewalls down on them and crushed them. These are 2 of the many members of the fire department that we have lost over the years. By the early part of the 20th century, as you can see here, this is Engine Company number 10 responding to an alarm. Engine Company number 10 was located in the Grant Park area at Oakland Avenue and Bryan Street. This is a staged photograph, and we know that it was staged simply because there's no smoke coming out of the boiler here, so they had not lit the coal-fired boiler off yet. but this was also done in order to practice their ability to respond in a timely manner. Fire horses were kept in the fire station along with the firefighters. The firefighters lived upstairs in these two-story fire stations, and the horses occupied stalls on either side of the station. This is Steam Fire Engine Company number 10, and this picture was taken somewhere around 1910. And I know that because the gentleman driving these horses was my grandfather's brother. He was a driver and one of the last drivers of the steam fire engines in the city of Atlanta. By 1910, technology had begun to take its hold on every aspect of our culture along with the fire service. Years before that, Henry Ford had developed and invented and produced some of the first automobiles in America, along with many other manufacturers. And also people began to contemplate the idea of, if we can use internal combustion engines to propel automobiles, why can't we do the same thing to take fire equipment to the scene instead of the horses and to produce the necessary pressures to pump water, rather than using a steam-fired boiler. So by 1912 in the city of Atlanta, they had purchased their first mechanical internal combustion engine fire truck. This particular truck was housed at fire station number 12, which was located on DeKalb Avenue in Atlanta. It was known, as we can see, as motor engine, and they also had a truck company there, but as motor engine number 12, in order to make the difference between the motor engines and the steam fire engines in the city of Atlanta, because it would take several years past 1912 to completely motorize and modernize the fire equipment in the city of Atlanta. This particular truck was extremely expensive, as the city paid $9,000 for this Webb triple combination engine. It was called a triple combination engine because not only did it have the ability to pump the water, but it also had the ability to carry the hose. And it also had a very large chemical extinguisher, a soda acid extinguisher that they carried mounted transversely on the truck in order to put out small fires. So it carried everything they needed in one piece of equipment. One of the drawbacks to horse-drawn fire equipment was the fact that when you had a steam fire engine pulling this piece of equipment to the fire, then you also had to have a hose wagon along with it, because the only purpose of this piece of equipment was to pump water. It carried no hose other than what was necessary to hook up to the fire hydrant. So you had to have a hose wagon along with it, which meant you had to have additional horses. And many times throughout the fire service history, you'll see instances where the horses fell, the horses stumbled, harnesses broke, and one piece or the other couldn't necessarily get to the fire, so they were hampered by the fact that either you didn't have the steam engine there to pump the water, or you didn't have the hose there to fight the fire. So the selling point by the manufacturers for this newfangled piece of equipment was the fact that you had everything. Everything was here by this dependable internal combustion engine. You could also do away with the maintenance of the fire horses. You could do away with the engineer that had to have the ability to know how to run a steam fire engine versus pulling the levers on a mechanical pump. So it was presented to the citizens not only as more effective and efficient, but it was also presented to them as a cost-saving measure. And as we all know, that if you want to get a government's attention, tell them you can do more with less. And this is absolutely the case within the fire service when they began to motorize. Even before they bought the first steam fire engine, the fire chief began to go back and forth to fires in this 1909 Buick fire chief's car. It was the first motorized chief's car in the city of Atlanta. And the citizens of the city of Atlanta were happy to see that their $1,750 went to a good cause. The gentleman in the back is Chief W.B. Cummings, who was also the gentleman who was in the first slide that I showed with a magnificent cigar in his mouth, pointing to the sky and giving directions at a fire. The challenge when you buy this new fangled fire equipment was the fact that you had a great number of firemen who were trained to manage horses very, very well. But the idea of driving one of these machines and in all honesty, the ability just to read some of the gauges and do this were very, very foreign to them. And they also had a tendency not to want to change. They were happy with the horses. They were happy with the way they did business. And if you go to a fire station today and listen to their conversations, the first thing you'll hear is every time we turn around, they're trying to make something different. So at this time, the gentleman driving, that was his only function, was to drive the vehicle, because this gentleman here was the aide to the fire chief who carried his orders to the companies working at the scene of the fire, because they felt that the person who drove the vehicle to the fire, his responsibility was to maintain the vehicle and nothing else. By 1915, the city of Atlanta had bought its first motorized ladder truck, made by the American LaFrance Fire Engine Company in Elmira, New York. This particular ladder truck was housed at the fire station on North Avenue between Peachtree and West Peachtree. If you're ever down there, this building, as dilapidated as it has become, is still there. It's one of the premier fire stations in the city of Atlanta and one of the nicer ones ever built. Fire station number 11 maintained continuous service from the time it was built in 1910 until 1996, when it was closed due to the fact that the building had gotten so dilapidated that it was not repairable, and also by the fact that modern fire equipment could not go any longer through these little narrow doors safely and effectively. I had the opportunity to work at this fire station as a firefighter, as a captain, and as a battalion chief. And I can tell you, as a driver there, trying to get a modern piece of equipment through those little doors, you had a ½ inch clearance on either side in order to get that magnificent new fire truck out the door, compared to these, what at the time were magnificently large pieces of equipment that ended up being rather small by today's standards. And you can see how small they are compared to the size of the firemen that are standing on it. Fire station number 11 was the last fire station built that housed only horse-drawn equipment, and shortly after it was built, by 1915, it had been replaced by a modern, mechanical, motorized, as they called it, fire engine. The city of Atlanta had grown, particularly after the Cotton States Exposition in 1906, to the metropolis that it is today, because as you can see, by this fire station being located on North Avenue, it was located at the northern end of the city limits at that time to provide fire protection for this new residential area in the city of Atlanta. It's hard to believe that there were ever residences on North Avenue in what we call now Midtown Atlanta, but as you can see, there was a residence on the left side of the fire station. There were residences throughout North Avenue, and the premier mansions and the larger houses in the city of Atlanta were located in this little street called Peachtree Street, as the city continued to grow north down the Peachtree corridor. So by now the city had 12 fire stations. There was never a number 13, because the fire chief at that time thought that was unlucky, so he would not number fire station number 13. The challenge in being a firefighter in the city of Atlanta, or being a firefighter in any major city, is most everything that happens in the fire service regarding codes and ordinances is reactive. By the middle of the 1900s, in 1915, 1916, there had been several fires throughout the United States caused and by the use of wood shingle roofs. Many larger metropolitan areas had outlawed their wood shingle roofs by now. And in 1916, the city of Atlanta passed an ordinance which outlawed the use of wood shingle roofs on structures. Now keep in mind, this is 1916. There was an outcry from the lumber companies in the city of Atlanta that they had no opportunity to exhaust their supply of wood shingles by the fast passing of this ordinance. So they lobbied the city council in Atlanta to say, we will postpone the ordinance, the enforcement of this ordinance, for a year. And this occurred in the summer of 1916. Unfortunately, in May of 1917, the largest fire to ever hit the city of Atlanta occurred. The fire began at the corner of Decatur and Bell Street, and a box number 46, was pulled by a passerby to indicate that there was a fire in a dwelling on Decatur Street. A single dwelling fire in the city of Atlanta at that time, with the equipment that they had, because half of the fire department was already motorized by then. The city of Atlanta said, we can handle this, no problem. But the problem was simply this. That was the fourth fire of the day. The city of Atlanta Fire Department was already battling a fire on York Avenue in the West End, on Woodward Avenue in the Grant Park area. There was a fire in the cotton warehouses at the newly built Candler warehouse on what was then Stewart Avenue, now known as Metropolitan Avenue. So when the fire in the single family dwelling that began in a stack of mattresses on the front porch occurred, the only thing they had to send was motorized ladder company number 12, which had a 50-gallon fire extinguisher, and that was it. The fire, because, and you can see every house here has wood shingle roofs, the fire began to spread. The only hope that they had of containing this fire was not there, for the simple reason that all of the equipment was tied up at one of the three previous fires. Dr. Joseph P. Kennedy saw the fire occurring out of his window at the Grady Hospital, and he saw the fire spreading immediately, because not only were the firemen busy at other fires, they had not had any rain in the city of Atlanta for 21 days, so these wood shingle roofs were bone dry, and there was also a prevailing 25-mile-an-hour wind blowing. The fire continued to spread throughout the day. The fire occurred at 12:36 in the afternoon. It was not extinguished until 11 o'clock that night. The fire began at Decatur and Bell Street, and the fire extended. By the time it was extinguished, it had jumped Ponce de Leon Avenue to the north and involved structures on Greenwood Avenue to a minor degree. At one point, the 17th U.S. Infantry from Fort McPherson was called in order to begin the process of establishing martial law, and also to dynamite the structures along Ponce de Leon Avenue in order to stop the progression of the fire. This was the same tactic that was used in 1906 at the Great San Francisco Fire, with absolutely no positive results. So once Atlanta decided to dynamite the houses, at that point all they had then, when the fire continued to extend, was burning piles of rubble along Ponce de Leon Avenue, all the way across Ponce de Leon Avenue into Greenwood Avenue, and even some into Drury Street. By the time the fire had been extinguished, 1,938 structures had been destroyed, and the fire had consumed over 300 acres. 1,682 of those structures were covered with wood shingle roofs. As I said earlier, the thing about the fire service is we have a tendency to be reactive. So shortly thereafter the fire, the city of Atlanta got into a lease purchase agreement with the American LaFrance Motor Fire Engine Company, and by 1918, the city of Atlanta was completely motorized. Every fire horse was retired, and it is noted that the last fire horse lived until 1938, and he died at a farm in the East Lake Meadows. All of the fire engines were American LaFrance fire engines. This was a horse-drawn ladder truck that was replaced with a motorized tractor in the front, and this fire truck was kept by the city of Atlanta until 1971. The tractor had been replaced many times, but this truck with its long wooden ladder was known as the Big Stick, was still used in reserve service when I became a recruit firefighter in the 1970s. Unfortunately, as buildings got bigger and Atlanta continued to grow, the most disastrous fire occurred as far as loss of life to firefighters at the Jazz Manufacturing Company on May 6, 1925. 6 Atlanta firefighters were killed in a floor collapse. Once again, this fire occurred the day after the initial fire because the particular building, this manufacturing company, had over 200 bales of cotton stored on the second floor. As the firefighters poured water on the building to continue to put the fire out, the cotton got heavier and heavier and heavier, and the day after the fire, when the firefighters came in to extinguish what we call hot spots, the second floor collapsed onto the first floor, killing those 6 individuals. By 1932, a couple of things were occurring in the city of Atlanta. Number one, the city was dealing with the effects of the beginnings of the Great Depression. And also, if you notice by the age of some of the folks in this picture, they're not exactly young. The city of Atlanta was not covered under the civil service rules of the city. The fire department was not covered under the civil service rules. Firefighters could work as long as they wanted to. So in 1932, the fire service in the city of Atlanta came under the civil service rules and regulations of the city, which meant each one of these gentlemen had to take a physical examination, which meant that the vast majority of the firemen in the city of Atlanta failed the examination due to age and poor health. And so began the process of overturning the firefighters about every 30 years. So about every 30 years, you get a new group of firefighters in the city of Atlanta. It began in October 1932 when the fire department came under civil service. By the middle of the Depression, the fire occurred, many fires were beginning to occur in the city of Atlanta in the 1930s. And by the middle of the 1930s, there was a fire occurred at the Cable Piano Company in 1936 that you can see was a significant fire. The loss of life was 4 citizens, but also this entire building was destroyed. This building was on Broad Street, just north of 5 Points. The effects of this building were simply that the firefighters were hampered here because of the fact that the city had not spent a great deal of money during the Depression on replacing equipment that they needed. So hoses were busting, ladders were failing, and there was a great outcry from the public to enhance the fire protection in the city of Atlanta, which they did, because a lot of this equipment that you see at this fire was the equipment that had been bought in 1917 and 1918. This fire also began a disastrous history of fires in Atlanta. In 1938, a fire occurred in the Terminal Hotel, which was located on Mitchell Street, right across from the Southern Railway building. There were 24 people that died in the fire, and it required what's known as a general alarm, which meant that every fire truck in the city of Atlanta responded to the alarm. As you can see by the volume of fire in the hotel, it was completely consumed. And it was considered to be a tragic fire, but at the same time, fires had been occurring in the LaSalle Hotel in Chicago and many other buildings, many other hotels, which had caused a great loss of life, simply because as buildings had gotten bigger and structures had gotten more complex, the fire codes and the necessary internal fire protection systems had not kept pace with the size of the buildings. Firemen realized early on that when buildings started reaching 4 and 5 stories or taller, that the ladders were of no use and that they would need to rely on internal fire protection systems and the internal construction of the building. And this came to a head on December 7th, 1946 in the city of Atlanta when the fire raged in the Wine-Coff Hotel. That particular building is still standing today at the corner of Peachtree Street and Ellis Street in downtown Atlanta, and it is a boutique hotel. What they did when they built the Wine-Coff Hotel was they kept the footprint of the building 50 square feet smaller than it would have been if they had built it 50 square feet larger. It would have required that the stairwells in the building be enclosed. So they built it just small enough to allow for an open stairwell, which allowed them to put 2 extra rooms on each floor. So for the sake of installing 30 additional rooms in this building, a fire occurred, the largest loss of life in a hotel to this day, when 119 occupants of this hotel died at the Weinkauf Hotel fire. The results of this fire were the fact that codes were increased considerably, requiring that all stairwells being closed in a building of this height regardless of the footprint, and also began the process of installing automatic sprinkler systems in buildings of this height. Ironically, in this fire, the builder, Mr. Weinkauf, perished in the fire that occurred in his own building. This is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph taken by a woman jumping from the upper floors of the Weinkauf Hotel in order to try to escape the fire. It was taken by Arnold Hardy, who was a Georgia Tech student at the time, and it also won a Pulitzer Prize. This fire was horrific in nature due to the fact that 119 people lost their lives. Because when you think about a year after World War II, that close to Christmas, the Weinkauf and every hotel in the city of Atlanta was fully occupied. There were no vacancies in the city. People from all over the state of Georgia were coming to do their Christmas shopping. There was a young girls conference in town at the time. It was a perfect scenario for a disaster. Also consider the fact that because of the Great Depression and the Great World War II, very little improvements had yet been made in the fire service, and much of the equipment that responded to the Weinkauf Hotel fire was equipment that had been bought in the late teens and early 20s in the city of Atlanta. Case in point was the fact in 1946, within 3 weeks of this fire, 27 firefighters in the city of Atlanta were injured at one single fire by the fact that their breathing apparatus, which had been perfected in the war to be used by airplane pilots, had not yet filtered down into the fire service, and the breathing apparatus that they used were just filter masks in order to keep the smoke from getting to the firefighters. 27 were overcome by carbon monoxide poisoning, and most of them suffered the effects of that their entire life. By the late 1940s, you can see that we're still looking at equipment that looked exactly like the fire trucks bought in the 1920s, because Atlanta had yet to catch up. The fire service and the improvements had yet to reach the fire department in the city of Atlanta until the early 1950s. By the early 1950s, we had built a state-of-the-art training center, bought brand new fire equipment, like this 1956 American LaFrance fire engine, and firefighters were no longer trained through the on-the-job training, but they were trained at a functional and effective training center. They were trained on their own time, and once they passed the requirements to become a firefighter, they were then hired. The firefighters worked for nothing through their training in order to hopefully get a job as a firefighter. The world was changing in the 1950s and the 1960s, and one of the things that occurred in 1963 was the fact that the city of Atlanta hired its first 16 African-American firefighters on April 1st, 1963. Prior to then, you have to go all the way back to Henry Lewis to find a firefighter other than a Caucasian that worked for the fire department in Atlanta. These 16 firefighters were located at the new fire station number 16, which at the time was on Simpson Road. It was a state-of-the-art fire station that was built with absolute segregated facilities. The African-American firefighters and the Caucasian officers and drivers lived in separate parts of the fire station as far as the bunk facilities and everything else. It took years in order to overcome this particular stigma that because we lived in the fire station that only people that looked like us could work in one. But in 1963, that changed. Atlanta was the first major fire department in the United States to go on strike. In June of 1966, Atlanta Fire Department Union Independent Local Number 1 struck for 3 days in June 1966. And in September that same year, 736 of the 798 firefighters walked off the job again. The issue was simply pay, working hours, and conditions within the fire stations. Even 20 years after the end of World War II, the city of Atlanta and most major cities were still struggling for everything to catch up. This strike was not started by members of the International Association of Firefighters, but by a wildcat union. The International Association of Firefighters has a no strike clause within their bylaws and agreements. The second most disastrous fire occurred in May 29, 1971. If you notice, for some reason in the city of Atlanta, and it's just happenstance, but May seems to be the most deadly month and the most dangerous month in the city of Atlanta. The 6 firefighters died in the line of duty in May. The Great Fire of 1917 occurred in May, and 4 firefighters were killed in a fire at the Davis Brothers cafeteria on May the 29th, 1966, going down as the second most deadly fire to occur in the city of Atlanta as far as firefighter fatalities go. By the early 1970s, the fire department had been completely and fully desegregated, with each company in the city of Atlanta having crews of different racial makeups. The only challenge left for the city of Atlanta and most fire departments in this country was the fact that it was still an all-male organization. We had included African Americans along with the Caucasian, but we had yet to include female firefighters. In 1977, the city of Atlanta broke that tradition by hiring the first 7 female firefighters in the city of Atlanta. Many of these firefighters worked until their retirement age. Liz Summers retired as a chief officer. Emma Morris is legendary for her driving skills at fire station number 16, among the busiest fire stations in the city of Atlanta. Lavinia Jenkins was one of the first paramedics hired by the city of Atlanta, and she worked at Atlanta International Airport until her retirement. By the early 1980s, a couple of things had happened significant in the Atlanta Fire Department. If you notice the little truck next to the pumping engine, this is a rescue unit. The city of Atlanta had gotten into the emergency medical business. Prior to that, the Atlanta Police Department ran the rescue units and the fire department ran the bomb squad, which was backwards from most cities in the United States. So in the early 1980s, they flipped because of federal regulations, and we got into the business of providing rescue emergency medical services through rescue units. Fire Chief William H. Hamer was the first African-American firefighter to become chief of the department. He was appointed chief in June of 1985. It should be noted that Chief Hamer was one of the 16 original African-American firefighters to work for the city of Atlanta Fire Department. The longest incident in the history of the Atlanta Fire Department occurred in 1987 at the federal penitentiary. The riot and fire that ensued, and we kept fire equipment on the scene for 12 days in order to try to help maintain control as best we could until the federal authorities regained control of the federal prison. One of the largest loss of lives in an occupied office building occurred in the city of Atlanta on June 30th, 1989 at the Peachtree 25th building. 5 members were killed and 25 people injured. But it should be noted that via the aerial ladders that were used at the scene of this fire, over 140 people were rescued from that fire prior to the extinguishment of that particular fire. In 1996, just prior to the Olympic Games, the Fox Theater caught on fire, and once again, the Atlanta Fire Department was called upon to save one of the landmarks, not just of Atlanta, but of the entire United States. The fire was contained in less than 25 minutes and did minimal damage to the theater itself and only occurred in the auxiliary buildings. In 1996, the city of Atlanta was prepared, up and ready and running for the largest event from one of the Olympic Games that had ever occurred. In order to do this, the city of Atlanta doubled the size of the fire department, brought fire equipment in from all over the United States of America. And for the period of 6 weeks before the games until 6 weeks after the Paralympic Games, the Atlanta Fire Department was actually the largest it has ever been or probably will ever be, because at that time, as I said, we had almost double the number of fire stations. One of our preparations for that paid off very well was the Centennial Olympic Park bombing. At the night of the bombing, which injured hundreds of people, the City of Atlanta Fire Department was able to triage, treat, and remove every patient from the scene in less than 25 minutes. The largest fire to occur at the end of the 20th century occurred at the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill on April 12, 1999. The fire occurred in mill number 1, which was the yarn mill. The building was under renovation at the time. And what made this fire spectacular was the fact that it was the largest fire, requiring 22 engines, 13 truck companies, 5 command teams, 1 heavy rescue, and 2 medical command units in order to extinguish the fire. It was also the first time in the history of the city of Atlanta that we performed a helicopter rescue. You cannot see it in this picture, but perched on this counterweight on this large crane was a gentleman by the name of Ivor Sims, who had no way of being rescued because the fire the building involved was directly under him. So at that time, it was determined by the incident commander to perform the first, and to this day, the only helicopter rescue performed by the Atlanta Fire Department. This was something that we had never trained for and never done, and with the help of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources helicopter, we suspended a firefighter on a 200-foot polypropylene rope and rescued Ivor Sims from the top of the crane. The question begs, well, why was Ivor on the top of the crane if the building was on fire? Well, the answer to that is he stayed in his post, assuming that he may be able to help the firefighters lift equipment to the building in order to extinguish the fire. And finally, let me say this as we close out the 20th century of the fire department. If I could speak for every firefighter who's ever had the job, I would simply say this. We have no ambition in this world but one, and that is to be a firefighter. The position may in the eyes of some appear to be a lowly one, but we who know the work that a firefighter has to do believes that theirs is a noble calling. We are defenders from fire, of the art which beautifies the world and products of the genius of mankind. But above and beyond all, our proudest endeavor is to save lives. Under the impulse of such thoughts, the nobility of the occupation thrills us and stimulates us to deeds of daring, even at the supreme sacrifice of our own lives. Such considerations may not strike the average mind, but they are sufficient to fill the limit of our ambition in life. Thank you. Questions?
Yes. First question is, what year was it for the first black fireman?
That was April 1st, 1963.
April 1st, 1963. Then there is a comment here. I have a collection of many replicas of fire trucks, including the horse-drawn pumper. I have one for years 1914, 1924, 1939, 1954, the year I was born, and 1974.
Wow.
So I bet you'd like this one.
That beats my collection.
In 1963, for the first 16 African-American firefighters, were they able to go to all fires, or were there particular fires?
No, every fire station in the city has one particular territory called their first response territory. Now, in the event of a large fire, those firefighters would have went wherever they were needed to go. There was no delineation. In fact, I know that the police department in the early stages of their integration only allowed African American police officers to deal with African Americans. But in the fire service, the firefighters went wherever the call was, which meant they would have went all over the city. Now keep in mind, as this process continued, the firefighters were beginning to be dispersed into the city as early as 1964, with firefighters being placed at Fire Station number 6 on Boulevard and Auburn Avenue in 1964. And by 1972, the fire department was completely integrated in every fire station in the city.
Okay. Is there currently training for helicopter rescues?
No.
No.
Well, let me say this. Our heavy rescue unit, which is known as Squad 4, trains with ropes and rappelling and that sort of rescue, along with confined space and trench and everything else. It just occurred to us that day that we had no other option, and the incident commander at the time made the decision that, you know, we would risk this. There was a discussion between the firefighter on the crane, the gentleman, everything, always in the middle of tragedies, things always work out. The gentleman that was flying that helicopter for the Department of Natural Resources was a gentleman by the name of Boyd. I can't remember Boyd's last name. I called him Boyd so much. He had flown helicopters in Vietnam, so he was used to flying helicopters under extremely strenuous and stressful conditions. So he had no problem. And let me say this, I usually don't mention it. I was the incident commander at that fire, and I made the decision to do that based on the fact he assured me, and his last statement before he got back in the helicopter was, he says, "I'm going to bring your fireman back."
Oh.
So,
wow.
And I believed him.
We have 2 more comments. We enjoyed the presentation, thank you. And also, although indirectly related, there was one death at the bombing during the 1996 Olympics.
Yes, there was. Yes, there was. She had a heart attack, I believe. Yes.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief Tolbert. It was fascinating and informative program, and thank you for coming to give it virtually.
My pleasure.
We really appreciate that. In the new year, on January the 8th, 2021, our speaker will be Victoria Lemos, creator of the weekly Archive Atlanta History podcast. Victoria's topic will be Atlanta's healthcare history, the history of early white and black hospitals and medical professionals. We look forward to having you attend virtually. Have a safe and happy holidays and Merry Christmas. Thank you.